Another new member, Daisy in the back corner, is an AmeriCorps at American Rivers, and she is now our secretary. She'll be taking notes, which we will send out at the end of the meeting. We also are now recording meetings thanks to Elias from Yuba Land Trust, and we'll try to have those up in the next couple days for people that didn't make it or if you want to rewatch anything. This is a trial though, it could go wrong, but hopefully it will succeed. And we also have Carl Ronning in the back from SYRCL, who's our vice president. So, yes sir?
Will that recording be available so I can send it around to the neighborhood?
Yeah, it'll have like a YouTube link that you can send out to
So it'll be a
anyone.
link on the
Yep.
web. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. So cookies in the back if you need them. If anyone needs a restroom, if you go through these doors to the back left, there's bathrooms back in there. Just a heads up for our speakers, we do not have a microphone in here, so please speak loudly so everyone can hear you. And yeah, so it's 15 years of experience in ecosystem services and watershed management to inform conservation finance efforts on public lands. He has technical expertise in environmental sensor networks, data processing, and ecosystem modeling, and he works with academic and other research groups to support land management decisions and policy decisions. So Phil's previously with Sierra Nevada Research Institute at UC Merced, where he focused on impacts to water supply and security from forest management, wildfire, and climate. Oh no. In California's Sierra Nevada. He currently leads Blue Forest assessments of environmental and economic benefits created by restoration projects that are funded through the Forest Resilience Bond, a financial investment tool for wildfire and climate resilient landscapes. So Phil, we'll have you get started. Generally for these meetings, we like to hold all of the questions to the very end after all three speakers. If Phil wraps up a little early, we may have a little time to question him directly. But for right now, Phil, go ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for having me today. I'm still a recovering academic, so there are terms or clarifications or acronyms I use today that you need some clarification on. Please don't hesitate to interrupt me in this so everybody is understanding the same language. So again, my name is Phil Saksa. I'm Chief Scientist with Blue Forest Conservation. Just incorporated or just transitioning to become a nonprofit. So we started out as a for-profit because we work with investors and we thought that's what they would like to see. But as we've worked more with the Forest Service and local groups like SYRCL here, we realized that being a nonprofit is really the preferential way to go. And it makes everyone a little more comfortable with how we bring investment dollars to public land management. And so the Forest Resilience Bond, I'll set the stage a little bit for what that is specifically and then how we use science to essentially support that. But it's really just a public-private partnership that allows private investment dollars to fund public land management. And so a lot of groups right now and a lot of, I think you've heard recently, a lot of the larger finance groups and banks are looking for more climate resilience in their investment portfolio. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done on national forest and other public lands. And restoration costs a lot of money, right? And so we know that the Forest Service and other land managers don't have the congressional appropriations, don't have the resources to be able to fund that work inherently. And so a lot of our work is how do we bring other resources to the table to help them implement the land management actions that they would like to see. And then provide investment dollars to fund it all up front to make it easier, to make it faster at pace, a faster pace and a bigger scale, to really meet the scale of the challenges that we're seeing today. And then ultimately, with the goal of, yeah, the investors get a small, low return, but ultimately it's cheaper in the end because it can be a lot more efficient. So I'll go through it a little bit. Is the right direction? Maybe. Oh, I think it needs to be switched. I think you switch it to the presentation. There it is. Yep. Cool. And then I think I left the YouTube link. All right. So an easier way to start the explanation is a video. So we will start with a quick quick overview of the Forest Resilience Bond, and then I'll talk a little bit more about it.
So here's how the Forest Resilience Bond works. Let's say a land manager, like the Forest Service, has identified a needed forest restoration project. The projects may include mechanical thinning, prescribed burns, and other activities.
The magic of dual screen.
Yeah. It's great and horrible at the same time. Hopefully you guys can hear this.
Activities specially designed to restore health to an overgrown forest and reduce wildfire risk. The Forest Service has already completed required plans, approvals, and environmental.
Or restart that.
All right.
So here's how the Forest Resilience Bond works. Let's say a land manager, like the Forest Service, has identified a needed forest restoration project. The projects may include mechanical thinning, prescribed burns, and other activities specially designed to restore health in an overgrown forest and reduce wildfire risk. The Forest Service has already completed required plans, approvals, and environmental permitting. Unfortunately, with the budget the Forest Service has for this project, it would take years to complete, if at all, and the forest is at immediate risk for severe and destructive wildfire. The worry is that a wildfire may occur at any moment, damaging the forest, water supply, and surrounding communities long before the project can be completed. Enter Blue Forest, a team of financial and scientific experts focused on financing large-scale forest restoration. Working with the Forest Service and the World Resources Institute, Blue Forest hopes to identify potential project stakeholders, utilities, private companies, and other organizations that can realize value from the restoration project. For this example, let's say that in addition to the Forest Service, a water utility, the state government, and a beverage company are also very interested in seeing this project completed. Each also has some available funding, but not nearly enough to complete the entire task on its own. Blue Forest works with each contributing beneficiary to set up contracts that pay for a portion of restoration costs over time, that together cover all the funds needed for the project, plus a modest return from the investors. Blue Forest also identifies an implementation partner. This organization will be the one responsible for contracting the restoration work on the ground. Blue Forest looks for an experienced and knowledgeable nonprofit that knows this forest and has relationships with the Forest Service and community stakeholders. Then, Blue Forest packages these contracts together to establish a Forest Resilience Bond, also known as the FRB, which is made available to private investors. These investors can include large pension funds or insurance companies, or mission-driven groups like foundations and impact investors that want to invest in local communities while diversifying their portfolios. And in order to avoid any potential conflicts of interest, investors don't have any say on the what, how, or where the restoration work funded by the FRB. Next, private investment funds the FRB, and the FRB funds are spent through the implementation partner to complete the restoration project. Over time, the contributing beneficiaries repay the FRB based on the value they receive from the restoration project as agreed to in their contracts with Blue Forest. Third-party monitoring and verification occurs throughout the life of the project to measure these benefits and to ensure that the work is completed. In the end, wildfire risk is reduced now, not later. The contributing beneficiaries have achieved their goals, and we all enjoy the benefits of a healthy forest, clean air to breathe and water to drink, places to recreate, and habitat for wildlife. The Forest Resilience Bond is an innovative public-private partnership opportunity that proactively invests in forest health before it's too late.
And you can see some of our partners up there. National Forest Foundation is our first nonprofit implementer here on the Yuba project, and we work really closely with with the World Resources Institute. All right.
So here's how the Forest Resilience
Oh, wow.
Let's watch it again.
Nice.
Okay. So that was just a quick video. Sometimes it's easier to use that as an intro for how we work. And so ultimately the goals of the Forest Resilience Bond are environmental. So how do we get this landscape to ecological health in a way that the land manager wants to see it managed? And so it also allows for certain financial gains for investors in the way that they invest and get a low rate of return. And we're not talking like venture capitalists. We're not talking folks looking really to make a lot of money off of this. These are really foundations that use program-related investments. They give us concessionary rate capital, which means just a really low interest rate, which is very nice for us. But it's also groups like insurance companies and impact investors who simply want to see good environmental and social projects get off the ground. And then also there's a larger social benefit. So how do we continue to protect and enhance protection of our communities, enhance environmental benefits and tourism to local communities, but also expand our wood supply products coming off of these lands. So how do we expand the biomass and timber supply so that private individuals can start to build the infrastructure needed, like the Camptonville Community Project, for actually taking this biomass off the land and doing something with it. So there's a lot more involved in the Forest Resilience Bond than just the mechanics itself. And ultimately, collaboration is hard, right? Nobody knows that more than the folks here in this room, right? And that's why you're all here today. So, financial resources are limited. No one group has all the resources to solve this problem on their own, or the personnel capacity to do it by themselves. So we shouldn't really create that obligation on any one group to both fund and put the personnel towards all this work. And the implementers we use, so the National Forest Foundation, they use a lot of state grants. Those state grants are reimbursable, right? So you actually need to have the money to do the work and then put your receipts into the state, which can then pay you back over time. That creates a lot of additional stress, issues. Contractor bids come in much higher because they have to wait to get paid. So by having the money up front through a Forest Resilience Bond, we can actually ease a lot of that financial pain. And these are things that people don't really want to work out and think about. And so that's why we created the Forest Resilience Bond. And then ultimately, every state grant, every public institution, every private group that we might work with, every utility, they all have different budget timelines, different capacities to fund and implement this work. And so by working with each of them individually based on their budget, their capacity to help fund this work and support this work, it makes it a lot easier for them to participate. They don't have to sign a 6-way MOU with everybody that might be involved in the project, which, as again everybody knows here, can be quite a challenge. And so the Forest Resilience Bond is really meant to be a communication tool between the beneficiaries of the work, and that can include the Forest Service or land manager themselves, hydroelectric and water utilities. In the watershed includes the state government. They want to see improved catastrophic wildfire reduction, public health, smoke emissions. That's all a concern from a state government standpoint, but also adjacent private landowners and private companies, again, beverage companies within a watershed, are really all concerned about these restoration projects and have an incentive to really see continued healthy supplies of water and tourism in their watershed. And so we bring all the groups together, and we, today I'll talk a little bit about our research partners. So we work with, continue to work with the Sierra Nevada Research Institute at UC Merced, where it was previously, but also Stanford and other local research groups that really have an interest and a desire to see a lot of the scientific work they do and have done for many years. Instead of just writing reports and putting them on the shelves, we actually look to put that into action and see how we can actually improve land management through research. And so the Forest Resilience Fund is really about connecting this investor capital, which when we think about the cost of forest management across the West, there are about 8 million acres the Forest Service feels like it needs to restore across the West at a fairly favorable cost, we would say, of $1,000 an acre to do that work. You're talking about $8 billion of need. And that's a lot of money. And while governments, individual state governments and utilities don't have those kinds of resources, who does? And that's private investors. The governor recently directed the state resources, investable resources, and that includes CalPERS, that includes the state teachers retirement system, to invest in more climate resilient infrastructure. And this is exactly what one of those things is. Those resources are $700 billion across the state. So when we're talking about $8 billion to that investment group, that's not a significant sum of money to them. And so that's the reason and the justification for why we need to have investor capital involved in these projects. And so the forest resilience bond is really, what are the benefits from a forest restoration project? Developing contracts with the stakeholders who specifically benefit, and then the forest resilience bond is just the financial vehicle. It's how we transfer the money back and forth. So this is what the video essentially showed, but this was created by a finance guy. So he started with investors on the left, and me being an environmental scientist, I like to start with restoration activities because that's what we want to see happen on the landscape. And so if we have restoration activities, what Blue Forest does is tries to figure out what are the co-benefits of that restoration project being implemented. Is it improved carbon storage and stability? Is it protected water quality, enhanced water supply? Are there hydroelectric facilities within the watershed that will see additional water and generation capacity? Are there other sources of benefits that folks will receive and will basically create the justification for why they should be involved in the project and even to the point of financially supporting it? And so those beneficiaries pay over time for those benefits that they receive into the forest resilience bond, and the forest resilience bond essentially pays investors back. And so the reason they start with investors is investors are putting all the money in up front for this restoration project through the forest resilience bond. Blue Forest doesn't manage projects. We don't plan projects and we don't manage projects because we honestly you wouldn't want us to. we don't have the expertise, we don't have the ability to either plan or implement projects. So the National Forest Foundation are implementer of this first project. They manage the contracts, they manage the work on the ground, working with the Forest Service to really oversee the project and get it implemented. And then that ultimately results in the restored landscape. In this first project, the Yuba project that I'll talk about, the Forest Service said it would take about 10 years for that project to be implemented across the 15,000 acres. With the Forest Resilience Bond, they're expecting to be done within 3 to 4 years. And so part of that is they don't have to wait for a timber sale to get some receipts to start to do the stewardship work and the habitat work that they want to see done. We can do that all up front. And it creates a lot of efficiencies where you essentially don't have to do a double entry for, let's say, a thinning and then to do the fuels work afterwards. You can do it all at once, which is actually an environmental benefit. So environmental goals of the Forest Resilience Bond. So to context set a little bit, I like to start with the report that recently came out from Kevin McGarrigle and those here on the Tahoe about what did forests look like, pre-European. So looking at the historic range and variability of forest characteristics. And I'm just pulling one of the graphics out from the 300+ page report, which I really encourage you to read. But this is forest canopy as it essentially looks like today. So what you can see on this landscape is the darker green, the lighter green are closed canopy and moderate canopy. You can see large continuous amounts of canopy cover. And then the pinks are more open areas. And that's what it looks like today. But they essentially went back and they modeled what this landscape would look like from natural fires occurring and Native American fires, the regular burning that happened between 1550 and 1850. And by 1850, this is what they expect the landscape would have looked like. And what you can see from this is a couple of things. Two, you have a lot more open area than open canopy than you did before, or light or moderate canopy. But the other thing you can see is that it's a lot more heterogeneous, right? So you don't have these large swaths of continuous canopy cover types across the landscape. You do see some of it, right? So there wasn't always burns happening regularly. So there are still some areas of fairly continuous canopy cover, but by and large, you saw a much more open forest. And that modeling was done in the Yuba River. This book by George Grell, Fires in the Sierra Nevada, he was a forest ecologist with the Forest Service, found a lot of photos from the late 1800s. A lot of you have probably seen this, went back and photographed them late in the 20th century and looked at the difference. And I like to use this one in particular because there wasn't any logging in this part of the Feather River at that time when that picture was taken. And so you can essentially see the impacts of fire exclusion and the density change of forest over that time, which is really pretty stark. And so what we want to do with the Forest Resilience Bond is how do we set this landscape up again to be able to encourage and maintain natural fire on the landscape again? You'll hear a little bit about that later today. And so we want to set these landscapes up to be suitable for natural fire so that they can happen regularly, because that's what we'd like to see ultimately. So there's a lot of watershed challenges, obviously, that we all are trying to manage for, right? So you have reservoirs and flood risk, you have water supply, you have hydroelectric power, you have infrastructure, you have communities, you have climate change, you have insects and disease coming into these forests. And so how we manage the resilience of these forests is really critical to how we maintain all of the benefits and potential risks from a landscape like this. And again, I want to reiterate, Blue Forest, we don't plan the projects on the landscape. So the projects go through their regular planning and permitting through the National Forest, through NEPA, and only at that point when they've been planned and permitted does Blue Forest enter and say, okay, down here it says, instead enables implementation. And so we really look to see what are the co-benefits of that planned project that's already been fully planned, and then how do we implement that? And the important piece to note is when a project's been planned, we look to fund the whole project, whether or not it's creating a specific, what we call ecosystem service benefit, or a specific benefit to the stakeholder. You can't just pick out the fuels reduction work and just fund that. You have to fund the whole thing. And so initially what we've looked at as part of our ecosystem evaluation is how does forest restoration impact wildfire probability and severity, and then the vegetation component is often already planned, so what does restoration look like? And that again is different things to different people and also to different areas. I know resilience and restoration are terms that get used broadly, and those are not one single thing, right? Those are different across the landscape. And then a lot of what we look at is what are the water impacts of getting restoration done? So how does it change water supply? Does it change water supply? Does it protect sources of water quality from source watersheds? And are there hydropower facilities within a watershed that could potentially be hurt by a fire or potentially be enhanced through restoration? And then carbon. Carbon's been more of a challenge. Carbon's a challenge for restoration projects as opposed to reforestation projects, because essentially you're removing biomass to basically protect the rest of the carbon, right, from catastrophic wildfires. So it's been a challenge to put forest restoration projects on carbon markets simply because there's that essentially initial negative net loss of carbon, but ultimately aiming for long-term storage and stability of carbon. So we're still working to get carbon resources and value into these projects through basically the lens of climate resilience, which is what we're all aiming for. So I'll talk a little bit about the Yuba pilot project. So this is the first pilot project of the Forest Resilience Bond. We launched this in November 1st of 2018, and everything was signed on November 1st, and 3 weeks later we had crews out on the ground starting restoration. If you remember, 2019 was a pretty giant snow year up here, which I'm sure you all are very remember fondly. So work stopped pretty quickly after it started, but we got a lot of work done this year. I think we deployed about $875,000 this year and did about 500 acres of fuels restoration work and set up a lot of prescription burning for when that can be implemented. The project is in the upper headwaters of the North Yuba River, so this is the project outline here. So when we looked at this area, we used the Forest Service's FSIM modeling. This is modeling from data in 2014, released in 2016. And basically, they run thousands of fires over and over to figure out what is the probability of a fire happening in any given year on this landscape. And that probability was pretty much between 1% and 3% on any given year, which doesn't sound that bad, right? But when you start to transform that over 30 years, you're looking at a 25% chance of a catastrophic fire in these upper watersheds because they have more snow, they're wetter, there's less risk of catastrophic fire. But when you get down towards the reservoir, you're looking at a 60% chance of a fire like the rim fire or the king fire happening in this watershed. And so once this became apparent to a lot of stakeholders, this is really, I think, what enabled some of the action that we saw after we started working on this. And then we looked at if this restoration project was implemented using a hydroecological model that I'd used back at SNRI. We had basically developed this model from really heavily instrumented watersheds that we had elsewhere in the Sierra. I used to work on the Sierra Nevada Adaptive Management Project during my time at SNRI. And so we had put out dozens of snow sensors and soil moisture sensors and stream flow gauges to really figure out, when you restore a forest, how does that impact water supply? And so what we wanted to do with that and the Yuba, the North Yuba River, is to say broadly, if we are to reduce vegetation within this watershed as part of restoration, as part of fields reduction, what impact could that have on the water supply to New Bullard's Bar? And so looking at the upper 160,000 acres of this watershed, we thought that we could see a 10 to 20% change in forest vegetation over the entire landscape, based on what the work we had done in the American River, where they had treated, I think, 25% of the landscape, and you saw an 8% reduction in overall vegetation. So we figured we'll probably do a third to a half of the Yuba if we restore this area completely. And so that resulted in about a 12 to 25,000 acre feet increase in water supply to New Bullard's Bar, based on the understanding that vegetation grows back over time, that there are other disturbances that might happen. But these obviously vary a lot from wet to dry years as well. So this upper one varied from 2,000 acre feet a year to 20,000 acre feet a year between dry and wet years. But interestingly, and I didn't put this slide up, the value of that water was actually very constant because water is extremely valuable in a dry year. So you can get $1,000 an acre foot on the open market, as opposed to a wet year where you can get 30 or 50 or $100. So, and the same is true with hydroelectric power, right? You can get a lot more value for that hydroelectric power in a dry year because you're not generating as much hydroelectricity on the market. So that was something for me as a scientist, and I hadn't really thought about the economic implications. And so that's why we work with the World Resources Institute, because that's all they think about. And so it was, and then we also worked closely with the Yuba Water Agency to understand their system, to figure out, are our numbers looking right to them, both from an economic and from a water supply standpoint. So this was really a collaborative effort to get at this. But it's important that we don't only project over time what the potential restoration impacts of water supply could be. We also want to monitor that going forward, right? So as the forest changes, as the climate changes, what is it doing to water supply? And so one of the things the Sierra Nevada Research Institute worked on was figuring out how do we connect these sensors on the ground, and these sensors are called eddy covariance towers, or they measure forest water use or forest evapotranspiration. And we said we'd place these in about 4 places in the Sierra, and then a bunch of locations in Southern California. And we wanted to link that with satellite measurements of forest density. And so the graphs you see on the left are, the upper one is basically what the satellite has an algorithm that predicts how much water the forest is using. And so they compared that with what they were measuring the forest was actually using. And you can see the relationship there was pretty poor. So they developed a new relationship that was based on the actual measurements that they had. And so we now have a way to translate the satellite data of vegetation density, called Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. It simply tells you how much vegetation is on the ground at any one point, and how much water is that forest using. And so we took that and we applied it to the North Yuba watershed. So this is the upper 160,000 acres. The gauge there at the bottom would be the USGS gauge just below Goodyear's Bar. And 49 kind of runs right up the center of that. And so we looked at this in the context of Bassett's fire, which happened in late 2006. And so the colors on this image basically show higher density forests in the green and blues, which mean they use more water. And then lower density forests or no forests, you can kind of see the Sierra Butte right here. So basically bedrock, so you have no forest. And then you can see kind of higher density forest, and which also means higher density fuels lower in the landscape. And so we looked at the Bassett's Fire, which happened in 2006. So if we look at this red outlined area between 2006 and 2007, you can see that the forest density decreased. You would expect that, right, after a fire. I'll kind of flip back and forth if you keep your eyes on that red outline. And so when we measured the change in forest water use over the entire watershed or forest evapotranspiration, we found that broadly it had decreased 4% in the entire watershed. Why? Because 2007 was simply drier than 2006. But in the Bassett's area, forest water demand decreased 28%. And so using that, we expect there to be that increase in water supply in runoff. So we're using this approach, and this is older data now. This was based on, it's continuing to evolve. You saw the relationship before. They've now updated that to a four-point algorithm that includes the vegetation type, the temperature. So there's actually some variables that have improved that over time. And so if we want to look at this through time, we can see this is 2003, so this is as far back as Modus went at the time. What you can see on this graph is that the blue or black line is the amount of forest water use for the entire North Yuba on average in any given year, and on the bottom you can't see there's individual years on each of these points from 2003, 2004, all the way up to 2016. The red line is Bassett's Fire. You'll see that's higher on average. Oh, look at that. Now you can see there's here. So the red line is the Bassett's Fire area. And so initially you can see that it used more water than the watershed in general because there was higher forest density. It's in generally a wetter area, so that is what you would expect than on average. On the left here, we have what's labeled forest water use, and this is in inches. So if you think this area gets 50 to 60 to 80 inches of snow and rain a year, the forest is only using 28 inches on average. And that's the reason that in this area you can actually see additional water supply when you remove some of that forest vegetation and return it to a lighter density. This doesn't work everywhere. This wouldn't work in the southern Sierra where you saw the massive tree mortality in ponderosa pine from the drought. You got some tree mortality up here, but it wasn't nearly as severe as it was down south. And so this approach for increasing water supply or enhancing water supply through restoration wouldn't really work down there. So I'm going to kind of run through this.
Can you clarify something on this? So
Sure.
are you just measuring the soil moisture to get these numbers, and not including runoff or anything like that? So
this
exactly
is
what it
all,
measuring?
sure, so this is all actually, so this is forest evapotranspiration, so what the forest is using to grow. Just like when you water your garden, it takes a certain amount of water, that's what we're measuring.
Based on the ADVI versus ET.
Yes. Continue. Okay, I feel like I didn't quite get into your question. I can enhance further because there's a lot of questions with this usually.
We'll come to the end.
Okay. There is a storage component to this where you have subsurface storage, and this approach can capture that as well. And so the vertical line will go forward as we go forward in time, and so we move to 2004, 2005, 2006. Hey, there was a fire. 2007, we saw that decrease in water. We saw some emergent vegetation come back the year after, which was not something, I'm not an ecologist, that's not something I expected, but this is the kind of information that we can see with satellite data. And then basically that died off, and then you see this essentially slow return to pre-fire conditions in the Bassett's Fire area. And you can see the drought actually, I would say, stunted the return of the growth. So basically it made it slower than we expected. And it's still not back to where it was in 2016. So this is how we would monitor restoration going forward. And if you can see, there's small white outlines up here. So this is actually the Yuba project area and where they're actually going to be doing work on the ground. Then we validate this with the USGS gauge. So the gray, so we want to close the water balance, right? So the gray piece here is the evapotranspiration, the forest water use that we're measuring through satellites. The runoff is from the USGS gauge. This line is actually the uncertainty from our ET measurements. So from these array measurements, but it's easier to see when I add it up here. And then the blue line is precipitation. So we're getting pretty good at figuring out how close to precipitation, which would be the input, is leaving through forest evapotranspiration, forest water use, and then stream runoff. And the other thing to note here is that forest water use and water demand pretty constant through time. So we know that there's drought years in here, we know that there's wet years in here, but ultimately it's much more constant than the runoff is, which we would expect, because we know when there's a really wet year, we get a lot of runoff. So, I'm not going to take you through this. This is just an example of we work with our stakeholders to figure out if we get this additional water, how often do you have to spill that water anyways out of your reservoirs because it's a wet year? How, on average, what do you pay for water? What do you receive for water that you deliver? So this is all information that we work with the stakeholder to say, are our numbers right? Does this make sense? Because we can't come into a new watershed, a new system, and tell you what this looks like. So that's the piece. And so the bottom piece here is looking at what is the potential water value if we were to restore that entire 160,000 acres. And for the Yuba Water Agency, it was something on the order of, we were thinking 20 million. And just from this first project, which was about 10% of the area, would be about $2 million over 10 years. So we expect the longevity of this impact to run about 10 years with vegetation regrowth. This top piece was just looking at what would stakeholders, including the federal and state government, have to pay to suppress a fire like the King Fire, which costs about $200 million. And if we're to avoid that today, essentially what is our cost savings over 30 years? And it's something in the order of $80 million if we can avoid that today. And that's because the value of a dollar is less tomorrow than it is today. And so accounting for some of that, and again, why I work with economists who think about these things and I don't. And so that's important. Part of the reasons the state and federal government put money into this. So the project work itself, time, all right. Okay, so the project work itself, it includes about 5,000 acres of restoration, including thinning and prescription burns and veg removal around power lines. But it also includes aspen regeneration, meadow restoration, invasive plant removal. So when I talked about we have some benefits from reduced fire risk, we have some benefits of removing that vegetation for water supply enhancement, but the whole project has to get funded, because we want to see this area restored to full ecological health with all habitat restoration that's included in the plan. We don't want folks picking out fuels reduction specifically or things that they think will help their particular benefit. So ultimately, the forest restoration benefits that we saw to Yuba Water and talked about them was reduced fire risk to their reservoir and infrastructure itself. They have a lot of woody debris flow into their reservoir. They spend about $1 million plus or minus every year pulling out logs and things from the reservoir because there's a lot of houseboats and that would clog up their intakes. That would only increase with a fire that were to happen in the North Yuba River. They're really interested in how do we create additional jobs and economic activity from this work, both the restoration work that needs to be done on the ground as well as the wood products coming off the land. Some of it's going to the Loyalton Biogen facility. Some of it's being bought by SPI. There's a local contractor doing the work on the ground. So a lot of economic activity coming off this project. And then what is the potential to increase and sustain water quantity? And not only projecting that, but monitoring that through the life of the project. And then ultimately protected water quality, reduced sediment into the reservoir. So this is what happened this past work season. So we got 524 acres of field reduction, about 3 miles of stream and riparian work, a lot of road work and prescribed fire prep. So it wasn't a great season to light prescribed fires, unfortunately. The timing wasn't right. So, and that's never predictable for an area like this, but it's ready when the conditions are right. And so we couldn't do a water supply assessment after this first year until the precipitation data that we use from the Oregon State University climate group comes out about June or July the year after, so we'll know what the water supply impacts were at that point. But basically, the more red the area is, the more vegetation change was seen or removed, and then the yellows and greens were pretty stable or some growth. And so some of these reddest areas were actually in the aspen regeneration stands, and I intuitively didn't think that was the thing. And then I checked with the National Forest Foundation, and they're like, yeah, we had to clear out a lot of conifers to allow that aspen regeneration potential to return. So that actually made sense to them, and so I was glad to see that was that was somewhat validated. And then what Andrew's going to talk about a little bit is how are we expanding this initial Yuba project to really think about how we restore the entire North Yuba watershed for fire resilience and ecosystem health for the communities inside as well as for wildlife. Looking ahead, I'm going to go through these a little quickly, but essentially we've done this for the entire TCSI area. So this precipitation minus ET is the runoff. In a term you probably don't use too often, millimeters. This is directly from SNRI. I need to convert this, but basically this shows you have higher runoff areas, the higher elevation that you have, which is expected because you have more snow and rain in these higher elevations. But overall, you get a lot of precipitation in this region, regardless. And so the red outlines are the historical fires back to 1985. And so we're basically using this historical fire activity to figure out how fast does the vegetation recover after a disturbance from a severe fire, a moderate type fire, or basically a low intensity fire. And using that to project what might happen with vegetation regrowth into the future. So again, my name is Phil Saksa, Chief Scientist with Blue Forest, and happy to be here today. Love to answer your questions either now or at the end.
Thanks for coming, and it's great to see this turnout. Being new, I'm also an ex-academic like Phil, and moving into the watershed and telling this story, but also understanding the communities that come along with it. And so today I wanted to talk about sort of three different things. And the first is to introduce myself. The second will be to sort of talk to some of the skeptics maybe in the room. And I had initially put this presentation as the North Yuba Forest Partnership for Skeptics. And I just want to see from a show of hands, how many people are hesitant or have skepticism about fuels thinning work in our forests? Just raise your hand. No, there's no shame, please. I really would like to see.
How do you define skeptic?
You could just say hesitant or what?
Could I say something?
I'm not hesitant.
I would sign up for being ignorant.
Okay.
And so learning about it, I don't have a negative view, but I have ignorance, and I want to know as much as I can. So skepticism, I wouldn't say. Ignorance is what I would say.
Okay. Yeah. Did you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I think it's totally necessary, but I want it to be done really carefully with an eye for protecting diversity and wildlife.
Absolutely.
Plant diversity and wildlife.
Absolutely. And I think that's hopefully what I'll hit on a little bit today. But I think we keep continuing to have these conversations around fire, around fuels treatments, and so much of it we don't always step to the very basic, right? And build off of that basic building block. And so for some, I think in this room, it'll be a little bit behind, and then hopefully, or a little bit at a lower level. But I think addressing that from the beginning, and because we're making huge impacts on the landscape, ultimately, right? And that protection of those biological resources, and understanding how to reincorporate disturbance. And so, to introduce myself, and then, the third part, to talk about the North Yuba Forest Partnership, actually. The whole reason. But to introduce myself, I'm in some ways an amateur fire ecologist, environmental planner, and I spent 2 summers in the Plumas and Lassen forests doing research on a couple of different fires. And I think in a lot of ways I hear fire management teams and fire suppression crews talk about the fire that defines their career. And by no way am I that brave or doing the incredible work that Shelly, CAL FIRE, and the National Forest Service do. But as a fire ecologist, I have a couple fires that have defined probably the trajectory of my career and are now influencing SYRCL's stance on fire ecology. And I want to bring these to light because I think I've seen sort of what almost a worst case scenario here in the Sierras on an ecological level. I'm not talking about the catastrophe in the Camp Fire. I have not experienced that personally. But spending months in what we might refer to as a moonscape, or these, what is the worst that could happen if we have high severity fires that are land cover changing, and what does that look like? And so I spent about a month and a half sleeping, living, and studying the Moonlight Fire every single day. The Moonlight's in the northern Plumas National Forest, so just a little bit north of here. And it burned above 50% high severity. And what that led to, and that was around 37,000 acres of this fire. And it's extremely influential because we're now 13 years removed from this fire, and we've seen a huge cover type changes. This didn't show up quite as well as I'd hoped, but this is fire severity on the left. And then on the right are cover types. And blue is true fir and Sierra mixed conifer. And so are forest types. And you can see huge, prior to the fire, that's the majority of this composition, right? And now when we look to the brown, what we're looking at are shrubs. That's ceanothus primarily and manzanita. And so this fire, like I said, 37,000 acres of high severity, and we're not seeing the recovery that maybe we would hope to see in a disturbance cycle and what resilience really looks like. And so this is the Moonlight today. It's a lot of snags, 6-foot-high white thorn, and there have been a number of studies about the biodiversity of bounce back. Point Blue did a great study on birds and bats coming out of this. But essentially seeing this and knowing what ecological devastation can look like and seeing what a shrinking ecosystem could almost look like, right? Like what does that mean? To have fewer species, to have fewer species of everything. That's from the forbs and the grasses to the trees, to our birds, to our bats. And yes, there are intermittent periods after high severity fire, which maybe we were talking about last year at Fire Science February actually, where certain species thrive. But longer term, if we don't see longer term, and 13 years isn't longer term that I'm referring to, but if we don't see that bounce back, that resilience, we know that this is changing for the worse. I hate to put a value judgment on anything related, right, to ecology, but we do know that we would like to see more biodiversity. I think almost everyone in this room could agree on that as a principle. Can I see a show of hands? Right? Anyone disagree? Objections, please. So, to keep moving forward, I also got to spend the rest a lot of time in the Story and Chips fires, which also burned on the Plumas. But what's unique about this is that the Story fire burned in 2000, and then the Chips fire came through and burned 12 years later, almost within the same footprint. And yes, there were large patches of high severity fire. However, what we got to see was this mosaic. And Phil started to talk about this when he said heterogeneity, right? And so when we saw these overlapping disturbance patterns, the heterogeneity that came out of it actually produced incredible life. And so that's life again, all the way from the forbs, the grasses, all the way to the overstory, from the understory to the overstory, and seeing these mixes in severity. And I think when we talk about fire risk and forest health, this is really what we're getting to, right? Is creating, if not creating, we're an agent of that change. We're not the creators of that change, obviously, but humans as that management and impactful force. So I think that's the summary on my end. And again, that's just showing what's influencing our forest health policy at SYRCL in some ways, but also I think are some of the guiding principles behind the North Yuba Forest Partnership. And this is a school of thinking that's coming out of I think that a larger school of thinking that's covered in the general technical reports, such as 220, 385, and a number of 237 as well. So a short defense then of fuels treatments and what are their objectives, and then going into back into it. And so there's this paper that came out last year that I think really breaks it down well, and that's Keeley and Seiferd's paper, and it's an imprecise science, right? They're distinguishing between two types of major fire: fuel-dominated fire and wind-dominated fire. Now that leaves out actually the third side of what's called the fire triangle, which is topography. However, I think this is a really nice way to synthesize this information on an easier level to comprehend. And so what we're seeing right now are both, right? What we're seeing in the Sierras are both fuel-driven and wind-driven fires. It's not, and every fire has multiple components of both. However, they break this down and they say, of the last 20 years, we can look to some of these fires and almost point to what is the major force. And why is that important? Because it has management implications. And so what they broke it down to is they came to this conclusion that a fuel-driven fire is what's on the ground, right? It's that the fact that we've had fire suppression, land management practices that led to an extreme amount of down and dead fuels, and then versus the winds, which are the Santa Ana winds. And so they broke it down into these 6 categories of what are the differences between these two. And they found that geographically, wind-driven is actually more common in Southern California and along the coast, while fuel-dominated is mostly in the Sierras, particularly the northern Sierras. Now that's not an all-encompassing rule by any means, but it has implications for our watershed here in the Yuba. They looked at past fire history, and they found that fuel-dominated often had greater, longer-term periods of fire exclusion, while it wasn't correlated quite as much to the wind-driven fires. Then prominent sources of ignition, not quite as important for this talk today. Seasonal timing, you're seeing fuel-dominated a little bit earlier in the season, right? Not those late fall, those September, October, November winds necessarily. And so, to just give you an idea of what are some of these fires. So the Rim Fire, which burned in 2013 through El Dorado, Stanislaus, Yosemite area, and then the Carr Fire of 2018, were both fuel-dominated fires. Those are burning earlier in the season, and the fuels are what's pushing this thing and having what we would say are catastrophic impacts. Impacts of huge patches of high severity. Carr Fire, not quite as much as the Rim. However, and then sort of these wind-driven events, where if we change the fuels on the ground, it's debatable whether it would have actually mattered, right? And there's a lot of arguments that come out of the campfire that say, well, why they did all of these fuel treatments. There were fuel breaks. So they had, however, the winds were so strong that in a lot of ways, those were overruled. And that's not true everywhere. Again, these aren't blanket statements, but this is an easier way to kind of lump these into bins. And so what are the management implications? Because how do we get the best bang for our buck, ultimately? Because there are limited resources in what we're going to be able to do to protect ourselves, but also to ensure greater biodiversity. And so on the fuel-dominated side, that point number 6 from Keeley and Seifert, in that the fuel-dominated side, forest health treatments such as mechanical thinning and prescribed fire actually get straight to the heart of it. As opposed to, on the wind-dominated side, you're right, your dollar is probably better spent hardening your home, creating greater wind protection systems, doing ingress-egress work, as well as power lines, protecting around power lines. And so, here in the Yuba watershed, which one should we be doing? Or which one's more important? And all of them. It's not one or the other. It's all of them. When we look at our fire history, when we look at the Cascade Fire, the 49er, the Bassett's Fire, and the Pendola Fire, some of the biggest fires we've had in the last 30 years, we can tell when you look at the seasonal, or 35 years, the seasonal changes that we've had both. And so we have to be doing both. And I think that's what the North Yuba Forest Partnership, we're trying to address all of those things. And so it's a huge and complex thing, and we're hoping to bring in partners as we go along, step by step, Blue Forest being one of them. But to put it into perspective, what our forests look like here in the Yuba, and knowing what our fire risk is, right? The fire risk of, according to CAL FIRE, for high to extremely high severity fire is almost 70%, makes up 70% of our land area in the Yuba watershed. So that's exactly what the partnership is getting to the heart of. And I'll talk about that a little bit more now. But so to put it just to make sure that we're all in the same place and knowing the same place. We're down here, and the North Fork, which Phil was mostly talking of, the North Yuba River, which Phil was mostly referring to, is up here, and we're going to go there next. But so the North Yuba Forest Partnership comes out of this fire risk, and where are some of our most at-risk forests in our watershed, which the Forest Service reached out initially to try and create this broader partnership to really address at scale, because the problem is so large. And we're using the Yuba project, that smaller project area that Phil discussed, that 15,000 acres, as the test, and now scaling it up to 275,000 acres, of which 210 are Forest Service land. So this is mostly a public lands related partnership and focus to increase biodiversity and take into account both the social and the ecological impacts if you do separate those two. So those 9 partners include a mix of both national and local. And so you can see from this larger list, I won't get into necessarily everyone's vested interest, but at SYRCL, our role in this partnership and what we're trying to bring to it is looking into increasing biodiversity, monitoring and managing, and making sure that those interconnections between both the forests, the meadow, and riparian ecosystems are all being considered along the way. So if you haven't necessarily been up there, this is a few snapshots. I was actually in the Bassett's Fire last weekend, and so Jamie to look at some of the conditions up there. This is one small stand of that 6,000 acres, where we see some of this, some individual regeneration, especially down in some of the lower lying areas and ravines, but largely there's quite a bit of shrub field, but not nearly as much stand replacing fire, which Phil touched on. And then on the left here, the Sierra Buttes, pretty low snow year, but unfortunately, just to give some images to it all. And so the partnership, our goals as a whole are to improve and restore forest health and resilience, reduce the risk of high severity wildfire, protect and secure water supplies, and then support the development of a local restoration economy that can create sustainable jobs working to protect our forests. And this piece is key because it ensures the long-term, the longevity of this project that lives far beyond where maybe some of our national partners are here for, and ensures that the work can continue to be paid for. And so we're exploring many different options. Allison, my co-Forest Health Watershed Coordinator, is working with the Camptonville Community Partnership on a biomass facility, and talk to her more about that. So, to jump back to what Phil showed, in terms of this historical range of variability, and this is the reference condition that we're partially using. This is one aspect among many of what a more resilient forest would look like, and using that time period between 1550 and 1850 as the reference. And so it's so dramatically different today than what we believe it was then. And so I'm not saying we're ever going to get back to this, but just trying to imagine what a forest would look like back then in relation to a more resilient and and stable ecosystem. If we think, or maybe stability is not the right word, I apologize, but a range of variability that is more refined than these extreme swings. And so today, what we're looking at, if we were to take the forest composition of what is in the North Yuba, and the early, middle, and late SYRCL stages of the forest. And today, it's about 20% early, 50% mid, and 30% late. According to that historical range of variability study, we're looking at 10, 20, and 70%. So this takes huge scale planning and a really innovative process to take everything into account. And so to bring some transparency to what the partnership is doing and how we're planning is we're still in our early assessment phase. We're taking into account the homes and the people who live in the Wui, the recreational opportunities, our keystone species in novel ecosystems such as aspen stands, the wildlife, the land, the historic land practices that have been here. So such as mines, being absolutely considerate of those. And then using the best available science. So this is our timeline for how that's going to look. And it's a slow process, and there's going to be, we're going to try and do our best to give updates as regularly as possible. And if you'd like to learn more, just ask. We're happy to answer. And I think there will be opportunity beyond the 9 partners. So to go back to the skeptics of this process, this isn't operating in a black box. On the planning side, nothing has been set in stone. Nothing has been submitted. There is no proposed action at this point. But we are looking to operate on that 275,000 acre scale. And so there is more space for collaboration. So please come talk to me. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew. We're going to jump right into Shelly Allen from the Tahoe National Forest, and we'll have questions for her and Andrew and Phil at the very end.
Awesome. So, yeah, as I mentioned before, my name's Shelly Allen. I'm a fire management officer for the Tahoe National Forest. I've been here in California for about 6 years. Just to give you a little background, because my slides and the way I see fire is going to be different from a lot of you in the room. So I started fighting fire out of high school, just, paying for college, that kind of thing. So I really mostly have been operational, so on the ground firefighting my whole career, starting on a hotshot crew, and then rappelling out of helicopters, and then I was a smoke jumper for 9 years out of Idaho. And so then I started looking at management and different ways that maybe I could kind of affect the system. So I've really always been on the ground mostly, and managing fires from a very young age. And so I think when I got here to California and I started looking at our land and resource management plan, it was written in 1990. The goals, objectives, standards in our management plan for fire and how we use fire on the landscape here in California was a lot different than I had been exposed to in places like Idaho, Montana, Alaska, Florida. I mean, you name it, just very different experience coming here to California. So I approached my boss because our current management plan really limits our ability as fire managers to manage fire on the landscape when we get natural ignitions. And when I say natural ignitions, I mean lightning caused. So if there's a lightning strike out on the landscape, we're very limited in our current forest plan. Our current forest plan allows us to manage no more than 5 acres. Flame leaks have to be less than 1 foot, and we have to be within 250 feet of a water source. So it's really limits us in terms of how we can manage those fires. So I went to my boss and I said, hey, I think we need to look at this a little bit closer. We were supposed to go through forest plan revision because, like I said, our plan is 30 years old. They were going to revise our plan. That didn't happen, fell through. So now we're looking at amending our forest plan. And the amendment, as I'm going to talk about right now, would allow me as a fire manager and then those folks that I have on the district. So I have overall program management for the forest, but then I have fire management officers on each of our 4 districts on the Tahoe that manage more of that operational day-to-day, when we get a lightning strike, who we send, how we respond, those types of things. So I just wanted to give you a little background before I jump into this. So we are looking at amending our forest plan to allow natural fire for resource benefit. As we've talked about before, and Andrew mentioned this and other people as well, you know, we consider fire a very vital ecological process, particularly here in the state of California. It is our main disturbance. I understand that, you know, we have a lot of other things to think about. Smoke, people live here, this is obviously a very populated state. And so I understand that it is a little bit different, but it is our disturbance process, one of a few of them that has shaped our landscape. And so we just, you know, really want to make sure that we take the opportunities where we can to utilize fire in that way. So yeah, it's talked about before, we had low mixed severity wildfires across the Tahoe. Those fires kept our surface and ladder fuels lower. Obviously they're much higher now. And you saw some of those slides that were mentioned earlier where parts of our forest were definitely a lot more open due to those reoccurring fires that would move through. A little bit of just kind of some of our suppression history, and again, I've been suppressing fires for a long time, so maybe I'm part of the problem. But you know, we were focused a lot on wildfire exclusion. You know, one of the things I like to mention here is, you know, one of my professors in college was talking about how, you know, we don't necessarily cork volcanoes, right? We think of we know at some point something's gonna happen, okay? There's gonna be something that as firefighters on the ground, we're not gonna be able to catch. And we've seen this over and over again, rimfire, all these like massive mega fires that we just, we are unsuccessful at catching those at a small size. So we're hoping if we can get more of these frequent low to mixed severity fires across the Tahoe, over time, we're treating those acres for when we get those major events that come in, we're able to get in there and more effectively grab those fires. So again, I talked a little bit about this. We don't have much ability there to do that. This is a really important slide for me because since I've been here 6 years, FY19 was the largest amount of prescribed burning that we've done on the Tahoe, 6,000 acres. And that's a lot for us, but as you can see, it's a very small percentage of our overall landscape. And so, you know, we have to kind of think a little bit bigger picture. Prescribed fire isn't necessarily going to get us exactly where we want. We got to start thinking about some of these other options. So yeah, we understand, I mean, public safety is obviously our #1 priority with any fire that we have on the forest. So what this will basically do with this amendment to our forest plan, it will remove the language that I talked about, the 5 acres or less, all of that stuff. It removes that from our current forest plan, and then it replaces us with the opportunity where conditions exist. You know, all of those things, we have a lot of programs that we deal with every day in terms of like where we're at in fire season, the type of fire season we're in, if we can manage a fire if it starts. It's got to be right time, right place on the landscape for us to be able to do this. And so appropriate conditions is kind of our main goal here. And so, like I said, it was 1990, it's been a long time. We would be evaluating naturally ignited wildfires across the forest to determine where we would use this potentially, and then make that decision on a case-by-case basis. Yeah, again, appropriate conditions. We have a lot of things we have to take into account when we look at these. So where is the fire? What are the fuels? Where are they at in terms of their drying? How wet are the fuels? The current predicted weather, topography, societal impacts are huge. And then also national preparedness levels. So nationally, we get drawn down on fire resources, so it's harder for us to manage. So it depends on how many people are available to come and help us out. Again, we go through kind of our regular checklist that we do all the time. We size the fire up. We have certain management actions we have to take. We go through a risk assessment, and then we do a periodic fire assessment every day on that fire as we work through it. We'll look at, the cause of the fire. So we have no ability to manage human-caused fires. That's a law. So the only fires we can manage are lightning-caused. So we have to make sure we know the cause of that fire, where it's at, what kind of fuel it's in, the weather that we're seeing. And then obviously we're looking out a long ways ahead to see what kind of weather and fire behavior that we can predict into the future as well. One of the things that we look at pretty hard, particularly here in California, has to do with social. So as you can imagine, living in this area, we all, there's a lot of, you see all this stuff on the news, there's fear involved. I mean, obviously you start talking about managing fires for a resource benefit, people sometimes go to, oh, they're just letting this fire burn. That's not what we do, ever. Every fire has multiple resources that go to it. Even a large managed fire, we typically have a type 1 or type 2 team that comes with like 400 people. So it's a very, it's very managed. It's not like, oh, we're gonna fly over it. Oh, looking good. I mean, it's a very managed event, and so just to give a little context there. Yeah, we've got a bunch of tools that we use. We have fire modeling tools. We have people that are fire behavior analysts, and they look way out ahead. So a lot of people with a lot of science background, tools that we look at to see where the fire will end up and where we want to potentially put it out. So obviously our, where we live here in our Tahoe National Forest, you've probably seen our map, it's very checkerboarded. So we've got a lot of private inholdings, SPI lands, all kinds of stuff within it. So there are areas that are going to be really hard for us to actually implement something like this. But in areas where we have the ability, we want to take advantage of that. And again, I talked about that, just it's not a let it burn kind of deal at all. So anyway, I know we're about closing up, so thank you. Appreciate it.